Okay, welcome back. In this video, we're going to fix an issue with aiming. And if you've done some playtesting, you may have encountered it. So go ahead and hit play. And notice that if we fire a round and we reload the weapon, everything works just fine. Now, if you fire a round and you aim and load the weapon, then there's something wrong. And that's because we are not playing 100% of the reload animation. It's blending with our standing idle aiming pose. So what we want to do in order to fix this is that if we're aiming and we reload, we want to stop aiming until we're finished reloading. And likewise, if we reload and we try to aim, well, we have to finish reloading before we start aiming. So let's go ahead and fix this issue in this video. So here we are in shootercharacter.cpp, and I'm going to search for aiming button pressed. Now in aiming button pressed, we set aiming equal to true, and then we change the movement speed to crouch movement speed. Now this is all fine and dandy, except that aiming button pressed is not really supposed to handle aiming. It's really just supposed to handle, well, whether or not we've pressed the aiming button. So we should have a Boolean called aiming button pressed. And that way, if we finish reloading and our aiming button is still pressed, well, then we can actually aim. And so this functionality here, setting this aiming Boolean to true and changing the walk speed, this could all be refactored into its own function called aim. And likewise, when aiming button is released, all of this logic can be stuck in a stop aiming function. So let's go to shooter character and create those functions here in the protected section. So I'm going to create a void function called aim and a void function called stop aiming. Now I feel like these are self-explanatory, so no need for a comment for these. I'm going to go ahead and create some function bodies for these. There's aim, and here is stop aiming. Okay, now in aim and stop aiming, we're going to handle what was in the aim button pressed and released functions. If we go back to aiming button pressed, we'll see that we set be aiming to true and change the character movement speed. We're going to take those out of here and stick those into the aim function. So here's the aim function. That's what we're going to do in the aim function. Now let's go to aiming button released and take all of this stuff, cut that out, and put it into the stop aiming function. So now these functions are handling that. Now let's go back and create a Boolean for whether or not the aiming button is pressed. So let's go to shootercharacter.h and scroll all the way down in our private section and create a Boolean called be aiming button pressed. This is only going to be used internally in C++, so no need for a U property, but we're going to add a comment for this and say used for knowing when the aiming button is pressed. It's pretty self-explanatory. We probably didn't even need that comment, but it's there. Okay, so back in shootercharacter.cpp, we're going to go back to aiming button pressed, and we're going to set this Boolean to true. So be aiming button pressed equals true, and we're going to set it to false in aiming button released. Pretty simple. Now we can go ahead and give this a default value in the constructor, so I'll scroll up and do that real quick. And we'll give it a default value of false. Okay, so why bother doing this? Well, when aiming button is pressed, we'll go back to this, we're setting the Boolean to true, but we don't want to aim unless we're allowed to. And if we're in the middle of reloading, we should not be aiming. And we know that we're reloading if our combat state is in the reloading state. So we can check that. So we can say if combat state is not equal to eCombat state reloading. If we're not reloading, well then, okay, we can go ahead and aim. So we'll call aim there. But if we are reloading, we're not going to aim. Now, if our aiming button is pressed and we finish reloading, then we can check to see if aiming button is pressed. And if that's the case, well, then we can go ahead and start to aim. Now, we'll take care of that shortly, but first I want to go into our reload weapon function. In our reload weapon function, we do a whole bunch of things. And what we want to do is check to see if we're aiming, because if we're aiming when we go into the reload weapon state, we need to stop aiming. So here, after we set our combat state to unoccupied, I'm going to go ahead and check to see if B aiming is true. And if B aiming is true, we're going to call stop aiming. And stop aiming is going to go ahead and take care of setting B aiming back to false and setting our movement speed. So if we reload our weapon and we're aiming, we're going to stop aiming. Now, if we finish reloading and we're still pushing that aiming button, well, then we can go ahead and start aiming again. So let's go to our finish reloading function. And here in finish reloading, we can check to see if we still have our aiming button pressed. So just after we set our combat state, we're going to say if B aiming button pressed, then we can simply call aim. It's as simple as that. Now let's go ahead and compile this and see how it works. All right, we're all compiled and we're ready to test this. Let's go ahead and play and aim, and we will fire a round and then reload, and it stops reloading, but I kept the aiming button pressed, so now it goes right back to aiming. Now if I release the aiming button, well, we're still aiming, so we need to fix that. So let's go back into Visual Studio and search for aiming button released. And here in aiming button released, all we do is change the B aiming button pressed to false. We don't actually stop aiming. So what we can do is simply call stop aiming, and it doesn't matter what state we're in. If we're in the middle of reloading, all we're going to do is set that Boolean B aiming to false and set the movement speed back to the base movement speed. So I'm okay with that. So let's go ahead and compile this now. And we'll go back and test this again. So I'm going to aim, I'm going to fire around and reload. I'm holding down the aiming button and we're still aiming. And now when I release, we stop aiming. Excellent. So let's see, we need to think about all of the use cases for this. One is if I fire around and I reload and I try to aim and I release it, nothing happens. Now if I fire around, reload, and try to aim and hold down the aiming button, then as soon as we finish reloading, we're now aiming again. And if I release, we're not aiming. Okay, so that seems to be working well. So now we have aiming and reloading states, and we now know that if we're aiming and we reload, we're going to stop aiming. And if we are reloading and we start aiming, it will wait till we finish reloading to go into the aiming state. Okay, perfect. Now, one thing you may notice is that if we don't need to reload, in other words, our gun is full, if we're aiming and we hit the R key, we'll stop aiming. And another thing we'll notice is if I go ahead and set my starting ammo to 0, so let's do our starting 9mm ammo, let's set that equal to 0, and I hit play. Let's say I try to reload while I'm aiming, I'll also stop aiming, and we really only want to stop aiming if we're actually going to reload, right? Otherwise, we shouldn't stop aiming. So we can easily fix that. Here we're checking to see if we're aiming, and if we are, we stop aiming. Well, down here, we don't do the rest of our aiming stuff unless we're carrying ammo and our clip is not full. So we simply need to take this if B aiming check where we stop aiming and stick that right here inside of this if check. So go ahead and compile this. All right, so let's go back into the editor and we'll hit play, and I'll go ahead and fire a round and aim and hit R. Nothing happens because I don't have any ammo. Now I'll go ahead and pick up some ammo and aim and hit R. And I aim just fine, but when I aim and hit R with a full gun, nothing happens. Perfect. So that concludes this video. Now aiming and reloading can exist in harmony. We'll see you in the next video.